Hey there, everybody. We're joined today by none other than Joff Walters, co-founder of Million Labs, the UK's leading no-code company on a mission to launch 1 million startups. Now, Joff is also the co-founder of Supertech, a firm focused on the development of professional and financial services in the UK Midlands. He's currently on the board of Apregio and a number of other boards, and CEO of Greater Things, a startup investment firm. Good morning, or actually good afternoon, Joff.
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm fine with either.
Okay, so let's get right into it. I mean, a lot of the listeners are B2B SaaS founders more often than not. So there are people who are listening who are in the beginning of stages of starting something, if not thinking about starting something. So let's talk about how you started with Million Labs. So what was the inspiration behind it, and why start it?
Labs is an interesting one in that it came from, we were actually building a B2B platform for corporate finance due diligence, right? That was what we were doing.
Mhm.
That failed completely. that did not work out. But we started using no-code tools to build that platform. And I guess what happened was we became far more interested in the development process and the tools that we were using than we were in the product that we were building. So we couldn't get
Mhm.
arrested doing what we were doing. But people kept coming into the office and saying, how are you iterating this thing so fast and so cheap? How come you haven't got £250,000 worth of developers in here? And so we pivoted. We said, well, what we'll do is we'll take the process that we're using to build our software and we'll sell that and we'll see what happens. We became really, really, really focused on how far we could push no code and low code and AI development. What was the fastest, what was the cheapest way we could do that while still maintaining quality? And to kind
Mhm.
of iterate that process, we figured it was better to work with startups than enterprises. So enterprises are slow, they have their own methodologies, they have their own processes and procedures, they have a lot of legacy issues. Whereas if you're building, particularly if you're building minimum viable products for startup founders, you get to do the same thing over and over and over again. So you get to
Right.
iterate. And that's really where Labs came from. I think I think the team there has now built something like 2,000 MVPs all over the world,
Mhm.
um, and yeah, you really get sheep dipped in what makes a successful startup if you do that. So that's kind of where
Right.
it came.
Right. So then what's this idea behind starting 1 million startups? Like why come up with that goal?
I think where did that come from? Um, I think well, first of all, we had the brand name before we had the agency, so that there was a little bit of retconning went on there. But actually, we really wanted to figure out how could we do something meaningful to move a startup forward in its journey um, in a scalable way. And if you look at the industry around developing tech businesses, it is not a scalable industry. Venture capital is a old-fashioned two guys in a room with bits of paper type of industry.
Mhm.
Um, and so we thought, well, what is standardization? What does automation? What does a kind of more industrialized process look like? Um, so if you look at I mean, Labs has only done 2,000 startups. That's a lot. It's not a million.
That is.
But if you look at what we've had to do that, we've had to automate so many processes. We've had to standardize so many processes. We've had to make lots of things into self-serviced processes. So this is a bit like building a bank. You have to have something that works automatically. You can't intervene a lot personally in startups' journey. So that's kind of where it came from. It came from an attitude of how do we do something completely different to the industry as a whole. Yeah. It's
Got it.
also
So
good
so
highfalutin
with
timing.
right, no,
Sorry.
exactly. So like with even a 2000 startup, you're starting to I bet you're seeing patterns in what works well, what doesn't work well, and the steps that are taken along the way. So what sort of patterns are top of mind when you're thinking about the startups that do well?
I mean, there are a couple of things that absolutely. are true and everybody knows are true. I think the first is that those founders that had done a lot of work to understand their customers. And by that, I mean not desk studies and, surveys. I mean, got out and sat with their customers and watched what they did, particularly in B2B and in SaaS. It might feel like you're building an automated piece of software, but the first thing you do is you sit and you watch how your potential customer does the job today. Why is it painful? It's costly. It's taken loads of time. It's, they don't have access to things that they need, which you could provide to them. So the founders that have done that kind of ethnographic work to understand their customers really succeeded because they built the right things into the product. More often than not, what you have is the opposite. People that have come to an idea from the idea and build what they think might be interesting, and there is no market for it. So that's the first thing. Customer understanding is the first thing. And the other thing, as we all know, is tenacity, grit, call it what you will. The ability to take the fact that the first product you launched doesn't work, but to be scientific enough and strong enough in your own self-belief to measure what did work and to iterate upon it, and to be able to stay the journey. I mean, I've sold 3 companies personally, companies I built and sold, not ones we invested in. And in all cases, they were ruinous financially for the first 2.5 years.
Wow.
I made no money for 2.5 years, and then we turned the corner and did all right in the end. And so, you have to have a lot of grit and determination and self-belief to survive that. So those 2 things are, I think, most investors would say they're kind of looking for that in the founders that they work with, to drive success. I think one final point I would make. It amuses me that everybody's read The Lean Startup. Nobody's read past the first 3 chapters. Most of that book is about being scientific in testing. It's about innovation metrics. And yet you ask people what the book's about, and they say MVPs. It's not about MVPs. It's about an MVP as part of a testing cycle. And so they don't do the kind of innovation metric thing of cohorted testing and learning and stepping up. They just kind of put an MVP out there and then go, "Oh, it didn't work," and give up. And that's a bad founder.
Got it. So it's a scientific approach, an iterative approach in a lot of ways to solving the problems that are coming up in a specific group of people that they're trying to serve, understanding them very, very well, and then having the grit and determination to continue that, and hopefully not be financially ruinous for longer than 2.5 years.
Yeah. If you can do it within 2.5 years, well done you. That's great, But, I think that's one of the things that most people talking to founders will talk about. Like, it's a tough journey. There is absolutely no doubt it is a tough journey. It is certainly not a great way to become wealthy. If you want to do that, go work in a bank.
That is one way, for sure. So then you built a bank, sounds like. So then what from those learnings did you carry over into Million Labs and then Greater Things and everything else that you've done? Because it sounds like it was a really formative period.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in some ways, because I was part of the first internet bank in the UK as a product manager of the first ever internet banking product. And crazily, that happened at the same time. Obviously, the internet was just happening. And so things like agile and open source, there was a huge amount of changes came along at that point in time. But we didn't really get to use them. We sort of approached that project in very much a 1990s software company approach or banking company approach to development. I ran another challenger banking program in 2015 to 2018. And by then, we had all of this learning from startup land. So we applied that in that project. So we had lots of principles like, we're a bank, we're not a technology company. We're going to reuse existing technology to launch this bank. So we'll go take the things that are out there that are already tested, already solid. We'll just do the things that we're good at on top of that to make something new and special. So we took a kind of codeless development approach. We took a very agile, very lean startup approach to building that project. and therefore there was a great deal more. There was a lot less cost and a lot more success.
Right.
So I think it's kind of the other way around. I think startups have a lot to teach larger institutions about how to approach innovation.
Definitely. Now, there's so much to unpack here in terms of no code, both in the adoption rate in enterprise and basically the leverage that it provides them because they don't have to code something from scratch in a lot of ways, but also the leverage that it provides new startup founders. Now, you're saying that it's a much faster way of developing a product to an MVP. Now, I was a software engineer. I understand like the initial portions and the value of hard coding something to a certain extent. But like, why should founders start with no code? Let's start there.
I think, well, first of all, I've started to kind of concatenate no code and low code and AI into kind of codeless because the change in the platforms over the past year has been for all of those things to start to converge, right?
Right.
And I find the sort of the language kind of dogmatic actually when something's changing that quickly. Having somebody try to tell you, no, this is this and this is this is useless. You sort of have to have a broader strategic view.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting is if you look at manufacturing, if you look at building a car, cars are built out of pre-existing components that are reliable. We know this engine from Honda is great, so we're going to put that in our car. We know the chassis from BMW is really, really good, so we're going to use that. And we're going to put these things together to make something new. So there's not a lot of bespoke manufacturing parts for engineered products, right? But when you go into code, for the past 10 years, we've bespoke built every bit of code that's been used by companies. And that's kind of mad when you think about it. The most advanced version of manufacturing is using the least advanced approach to manufacturing. So I think
Mm-hmm.
what codeless development did was it brought that concept of if I need a payment gateway, I'm going to go use Stripe because that's good enough. And I'm never going to be able to put something together quick that's that good.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to use a UI, well, I can pull from login boxes always look the same. Dashboards always look the same. So let's go pull together something that exists that's good enough, particularly for a startup, to prove what it is that we need to prove, which is that, I don't know, customers want a better platform for purchasing hair products. That's just e-commerce. I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head. That's awful.
Right.
So I think it's taking a modern approach to software development. Where should we be coding? There is always those either deep tech or like there are guys out there that are still trying to build a better engine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then sell that engine to the world. That's the equivalent in code is, right, I can build a faster search algorithm. I can build a better way of doing something and then sell that to everybody else as a component. So there will always be that leading edge, but I don't think we need to be bespoke building the base components that we all use over and over again. And that's where my head's at. The net effect
Right.
for founders is twofold, really. The cost of getting projects live is now tiny. It's less than $10,000 for a lot of people, and the time is
Mm-hmm.
fast. If you are really living in lean startup, you can get the first product into customers' hands in weeks.
Right.
But I think the real other thing that we're seeing within the portfolio is that the burn rates are very, very low because instead of hiring tech teams and having them sit there and therefore have to feed them stuff to do, we'll keep working on product development, keep doing stuff. What we're seeing is people building MVP version 1 with an agency team or a freelancer or doing it themselves, putting it into the world, having like less than $1,000 a month worth of tech cost, right? And then they just live through this period of time like, okay, let's try to get the customers on. Okay, it didn't work. Let's do a few $100 worth of iteration and carry on. And so the burn rates are so low. I can tell you, our expectation in our portfolio was that 1 in 10 startups would survive 2 years. And currently,
Mm-hmm.
we've only lost a third of the startups. And that's why, because
Wow.
the cost is so low. The
Got it.
success has been higher as well.
So you can attribute that to no code and
Yeah,
that general approach.
yeah, it's entirely
Now,
that.
so then I think in a lot of ways, considering what we're seeing over the past year in terms of code near codeless, approaches to startup founding or starting a startup. Where instead is a lot of that effort best allocated?
I think there is this. I mean, we've got a changing concept of outreach to customers, which I think has put us back in an old school sales model in some extent. So building relationships, a bit like what we're doing here, building
Right.
relationships, getting to know people, getting to understand what their needs are, and having those really be ahead of then selling. That's a different effort structure for particularly for B2B. So we're back to old school sales. And so what we're seeing with a lot of the founders is, it's kind of digital shoe leather, right? I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
build up a base of I'm going to be a thought leader in my space. I understand what it is I do. I'm going to get that message out there. I'm going to find the people that resonates with, and then start filtering through the ones that would be interested in buying my product. And then I'm going to do that old school closing job. And so because tech, in startups, it used to be like 60% of spend was tech, but by the time they launched, 90% of spend was tech, and everything else had to fit in that tiny amount of money that was left.
Right.
Now it's kind of tech is dropping to the smaller percentage, and the time cost and the financial cost is sales and marketing. And I think that's right. I think that's the right way round. It's hard for investors because they want to invest in asset, they want to invest in the box. But the reality is that's where the spend needs to go.
Right. So then a founder is essentially, instead of building the tech platform, they're instead building a community, a deep understanding, and a strong set of relationships with those end users. Right. That's
Yep.
the valuable asset, I think, right?
Yeah. It's like Ben Horowitz said, in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is a great
Yeah.
title for a book about startups.
A great book.
That thing of getting to know who the checkbook is, but also who's going to use it and who's going to install it, and then going and getting to know those people and understanding their challenges. I spoke to a founder this morning who came to me, and the checkbook had changed in the company she was selling to. And
Mm-hmm.
she said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, you now have the job of building a relationship with a new, budget holder. There's no way around that. You have to know all of those people to get this thing sold." Well, how do you do that? Well, she already knows people in the company. She can network from those relationships. It's a very old school skill, but it is the most valuable skill you can possibly have. I feel like tech has sort of distracted founders. Founders think behind a screen. They think they can train a robot to go and fire lots and lots of messages out, or they can use social media advertising or pay-per-click advertising. We see it work so rarely in the early stages of startup because they don't understand their customer. Their customer's hiding behind a wall of digits, effectively. So
Right.
yeah, I think the time spent on getting to know people that will buy your product is extremely valuable for lots of reasons.
Right. So then for startup founders who are essentially starting to allocate a lot more of their time to simply just building up those relationships, what sort of questions or what sort of framework come to mind to most effectively build those relationships and get through to them as well? Because we know like a lot of these key decision makers are hidden behind gatekeepers or layers of management.
I think that's a really good point. I think so. I mean, we've had this concept of differentiating yourself and thought leadership. If you're in a startup, people should be angry that what you do doesn't exist, right? That's
Mm.
if people aren't angry that what you do doesn't exist, then there probably isn't a gap in the market. And so being able to get out there and kind of grab that space as somebody that understands it is the first step, right? You're positioning yourself as looking after giant tortoises isn't done properly, and I'm the giant tortoise guy. One of
Mm.
the things that I think founders have failed to do is they try to get out and do that before they really are that person. They haven't done the research. They haven't actually got the credibility because they haven't got the evidence base behind them, right? So I can stand up and talk about codeless development because since 2018, I've been spending a vast sum of money on that. So I've seen lots and lots of things.
Right.
I can talk about that with some gravity because I know that market well because I've spent my time in it. And so I think you have to have that credibility. You can then get out the front. And what happens is people start to self-identify. I want to buy what you're selling. This is kind of at the heart of business development loops and things like that. Instead of me selling to you, I'm going to event, I'm going to talk, I'm going to be present, and people will start to put their hand up and say, hey, I want the thing that you say you've solved. And that just makes this whole selling process a lot easier. Now, all of this sounds kind of manual. You can make this systemic. You can use the tools that are out there to have those people that identify themselves go into a pipeline and look, you can book a meeting with me. And in the meantime, here are some things that you can read that are going to make you more likely to buy once we get in front of each other. So there are ways of turning this into a modern process. But that idea of getting people to self-identify as buyers always fascinates me because it seems to be the thing that happens in the end in successful businesses.
Exactly. So then it really is about community building. It's about connecting with people at a deep, visceral level, what are their deepest pains, what are their deepest desires. But then I think, if anything, this brings up an idea, because I think originally in tech, at least, the disruptors are usually people, historically, people who have had an idea for an existing near archaic system, and they flip it on its head with a new automated business model, right? You could say generally that could be a way to summarize it. Now, which sounds to me like what you're saying is that in the near future, we're switching to, or if not already switching to, more of a thought leadership approach, where you have to have a deeper understanding of those problems with years of experience within the field to then have the backing of the community, have the weight, the credibility to even say that you can solve this problem, that you know that this problem is something that's worth solving.
Well, I think every overnight success that you ever meet will tell you that they weren't an overnight success, right? So it's strange how quickly you build up that understanding and that credibility in a space, and you do it by trying, right? That's the lean thing. That is, we put this product out into the market, it didn't really stick, but what we learned was this, and so we changed and we kept moving forward. And so you will build up that credibility naturally. I mean, even when I think about the most massive, most clearly technology-led businesses out there, they tended to start from a place of, Mark Zuckerberg trying to meet girls in the next college, or I know
Right.
that's a very physical thing.
It is.
He understood his community because his community were people like him that wanted relationships with people just over the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, I guess what I tend to coach people with is, it is amazing how much that human understanding of the world around you and those human communities grow to become big digital communities. And it's amazing how fast that happens. When you think about the core base in a community for big startups, as an alpha tester on a few quite famous brands,
Mm-hmm.
to begin with, it's like 20 twizzle-eyed lunatics in a room, and then somehow that advocacy ekes out into the first scaling community and then out into a bigger scaling community. So actually that small group of people can have a substantial effect that takes you through that first couple of years of growth. It's very, 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 very rare that a business has gone from a few hundred users to 1 billion users overnight. It tends to be a slide through the first 3 years.
Right. Now, if we were to look at some of the most recent success stories, Lovable, Cursor, ChatGPT, Midjourney, and there are a series of AI startups that are starting to upend those established patterns that we've all observed over the past decade or two. What are you seeing there? What are your thoughts on some of these actually getting to 10, if not $100 million ARR in a matter of 2-3 years?
I think this is really, first of all, this reminds me of kind of when we went through the sort of dot-com boom. And again, I'm old, the great, as
I
people have been
remember it.
around.
Don't worry.
And genuinely, sort of, people will always talk about mobile as being a huge enabler, and mobile felt like another step on the same ladder as kind of internet. Whereas AI doesn't. It has that same feeling as when the internet first came along, in that it's just enabling a whole swathe of change that didn't exist 2 years ago. So it's 80%. 80% of the startups we currently have coming through are consuming an AI service and using it for a thing. They're not building their own AI service. They're consuming it and using it for a thing. And the applicability of that to absolutely fundamental changes in massive corporations is huge, absolutely huge. So trying to bet on what the winners are going to be is really hard, because there's just so many of them. We're all as smart as each other. We can all see this is a route of travel, right? I think the ones that are going to win are the ones that tackle big and obvious cost pain points within major corporate spaces. So legal, accountancy, financial services. They're taking out, it's awful. Our investment business uses AI to do our underwriting. I do not pay what in the UK would be former graduates of Eton, who become investment managers. We don't have them. We have a robot. So we save hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. And I feel bad because they're all going to be redundant, because you don't need them. The robot does a good job.
Right.
But those, I think that's what we're seeing the first swathe of human replacement within big corporations, but we're also seeing that creating services that never would have existed before. And I sort of feel a bit like, what happened when the internet came along, as we suddenly discovered social media, for instance. I kind of feel it's the same with AI. The big winners, yes, they're going to be the Googles and the Microsofts that are offering the servers that host these services. And the other winners are going to be the people that find the big use cases, which are, as I say, probably going to be human replacement in what were pretty boring jobs, actually. That's my guess.
Right, no, and I completely agree. I'm seeing a lot of the same things.
Frozen.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Awesome.
I thought I bored you into.
No. I'm fully here. It's really interesting because I'm seeing a lot of the same things, and I'm connecting with a lot of these AI founders, especially in the sales and the marketing space. It seems like a lot of people are trying to gear up to disrupt certain parts of the sales and marketing process, especially for enterprise or account-based sales. Now, What I'm seeing is that people are testing and proving out that one AE that is augmented properly can do the work of 10 to 20 salespeople, a full service, and entirely new roles are being created. I don't know if you've ever heard of a go-to-market engineer, but that's something that I'm seeing only just start to fizzle up out of what people are experimenting with. So I can imagine that in legal, in accounting, in the financial services, with what you're seeing with super tech, that you're starting to potentially see, but at least maybe even the possibility for these new hybrid roles.
Absolutely. And we're seeing some really interesting, I was listening to a chap here, a guy called Dave Birch, talking about, the concept of AI agents, so people that are servicing you when you're talking to your banking is my one, so when you're talking to your bank. But he's talking about AI customers as well, right? I don't want to go deal with my bank. I don't want to deal with a lot of the things that I have to deal with as a person. And so we have this kind of legitimate question about what happens when my AI sort of customer is talking to your AI agent, and managing those things that in our lives are pointlessly difficult and time consuming. So they can all be done by two robots now, right? And I just think I love it, because it's hard to conceptualize the amount of opportunity that there is for taking unstructured data, turning it into structure, and then taking structure and turning it into creativity, effectively, which is where AI exists. Right. The way that I've coped with this without going insane is to realize that I'm old enough now to put the rails down to invest in people that are really bright and doing these things, so that I don't have to think about it. Effectively, I built a beehive for the bees to live in and do all the honey creation, because I feel like I burnt myself out in the .com boom, so now I need
Aha.
to kind of step back and let brighter minds do a good job.
But you're also mentoring and coaching these people to not make a lot of the same mistakes that maybe you made, or even the mistakes that you're seeing other people make, right? So,
Absolutely.
which is why the 1/3 instead of the 1/10 success rate.
Yeah, and I think, as you get older, you start to, bright people get it straight away. I had to get old. But you have this thing of realizing that the basics are what makes the success. You can't, if you delve down into the technology, if you get lost in the technology and you lose sight of the standards of who's going to pay me for this, how are we going to get them to pay us on a sustained basis, making sure that your costs are less than than the money you're taking off your customers. If you lose sight of that because you're so buried in the opportunity of the technology, you never get a chance to prove anything. And so a lot of the mentorship is really getting people out of the distraction of what they're playing with and back up into how are we going to package this and sell it. Right? I
Right.
mean, I think the other thing that you get at this point in time, and we're going to see right now, is people trying to apply old rules to new technology. So, my daughter was talking to me about artists being upset that AI is being used to create award-winning art in art competitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have people trying to create mitigating, like things that go in front of art so the art can't be stolen, or mitigations in terms of regulation. And there's a juggernaut happening right now, and it's just going to roll over them. So the job is not to try and fight it, it's to try and figure out how do we create a new structure around this new world that we live in right now. And one of the things that you see in startup land is people trying to charge, like we used to charge $150 an hour for our associates to read your legal contract. And we now have
Mm-hmm.
an AI thing doing that. So we're going to try and charge the same amount. It's not going to work because the kids around the corner are going to offer that for 10 pence because that's what it's costing them to service. So that change is just going to roll over companies as well. So you have to live in the new world that we've created and not try and fight back to get to the old one. It kills you.
Right, right, exactly. So then taking that maybe a step further, if we were to kind of like look at the trajectory of AI and assume that, okay, most things will get automated, most most processes, most tasks, most infrastructure, then we could potentially see a world where it really just comes down to human connection. Like you said before, it's all going back to old fashioned sales, human connection. How deeply do you understand the customer and their pain points, and how well can you serve on them? So then, in a future where maybe features like software are actually brought down to zero, where hosting is brought down to near zero, what is the value point at that point becomes a question. Is the world,
It does.
well, this is going to become a question, I swear. Um, will it become a world where a lot of the complication that gets in the way of actually impacting other people's lives are taken away or are removed, and it really just becomes a world of impact, of how fast can you make something that actually impacts people on the other side? Is that something that you're seeing? Is that something that you're hypothesizing? Like, what are your theories about the next 5 to 10, if not more, years?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's possible to live in a real echo chamber, right? Codeless is a huge echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
AI is a huge echo chamber. And you can lose sight of the fact that the wider world is quite a long way behind you in adoption, right? I mean, I was talking to the CEO of a local technology business the other day, and they're still working on old Laravel, kind of really old tech stacks.
Mm-hmm.
It's 7 or 8 years worth of labor in modernizing all of this, and they'll be paying us that for nearly the next decade. There is a bank that we went into not long ago that was running a system from 1950. I think it was on COBOL. So yeah.
Yep.
This it takes a long time for the legacy to change, and that's something to be aware of. It's like in sci-fi movies. In sci-fi movies, they say 100 years in the future and everything's silver and glass and there's flying cars. Well, if you look at at a street that's 100 years old, you might have a couple of houses that were built in the past 5 years, but the rest of them are all from years and years and years ago, right?
Exactly.
Kind of what the future looks like. It doesn't immediately change overnight. I guess that's the point. What do I think is going to happen? I do think the cost of technology is plummeting, and therefore we'll get commoditization. It's just so easy to build a thing. What's going to win? Price is going to win. So it'll only be the most substantial versions of things that can trade in certain markets after a while. And you can see that banking is a perfectly good example of that. Banking's heavily commoditized. You can get your credit card anywhere. It's very little to differentiate it.
Exactly.
So I can see that happening in quite a lot of spaces. I think the thing that fascinates me most of all, within software, is what creativity looks like when you've got a paintbrush as powerful as AI. I cannot imagine. Now we've got this phenomenal kind of capability at our fingertips. I cannot imagine how far we can push that. And I think that's where we all are at the moment. It's like, this is here. We're all making wild stabs at what the future might look like. But this enormously powerful creative tool has just landed on our laps. So it's hard to kind of spot the road ahead. Yeah, so this is why I say I've kind of checked out. I get other people to do that for me now.
Right, which is a smart approach, honestly.
Yeah.
So then, I guess if anything, if we're all taking wild stabs, and the future, nobody can really truly predict what it's going to look like, and when you say, okay, it looks like the houses on a street, some are brand new, some of them are from 50 years ago. Well, then, maybe this might be the last question. What would you say will differentiate successful founders from not successful founders in the near future, where AI is a paintbrush, where it is as powerful as we believe it will be, and as it's proving to be?
I think the interesting, and as you've discovered from this past 40 minutes that we've spent together, my mind wanders all over the canvas, and I'm sorry for that.
Don't worry about
it. I think the interesting thing for me is if you look at the music industry, right? The cost of distribution of music disappeared years ago. So, it's just digital.
Right.
And the cost of production of music disappeared years ago as well. When I was a kid, you used to have to go to a recording studio and have an engineer sat there with a massive desk. And now, a laptop is perfectly capable of doing what an entire recording studio did years ago. So the music industry kind of points the way, actually. And if you look at, I'm going to use Charlie XCX because she just won a load of Brit Awards here this past week. If you look at what differentiates her, it's a story. It's that she's interesting, right? Anybody could have produced. Sorry, Charlie XCX, if you listen to this, which I really doubt you ever will. But it's the music that she produces is probably just the same or as good or very similar to a lot of other music that was produced. So why her, right? So we get to, how do we create a narrative around someone? How do we create them as the product? How do we create their brand as the thing that people want to be involved in? What is it? Well, it's, and so I think you can look at the Simon Cowells of this world who realized during that period of time that you needed a narrative, you needed a reason to hook onto this version of good rather than the myriad, the commoditized, the million versions of good elsewhere. And that still comes down to humanity. It comes down to human connection, human stories. That's what Simon Cowell did. He had, people's nan had died, and that's why they're recording their music. So you connect with them. My nan died. I like that. I don't like nan stuff. But it's that human connection that brings people in. So I sort of think the founders of the future will continue to learn to promote themselves or their wider brand and the service that rolls behind them, so that there's a reason for people to be interested in what they do rather than all of the other lookalikes that are available at the same time. That's where I kind of feel that the puck might go.
Beautiful. Well, Joff, I think that might be a great place to leave it off at. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This has been Joff Walters, co-founder of Million Labs, CEO of Greater Things, and board of many things. Joff, thanks for taking the time.
No problem at all. Nice to do it, Jose.